Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Kitabi Karwan podcast. Today we have with us, well, not an author, but a bibliophile whose work in the field of business journalism is extremely well known. She's none other than Mitali Mukherjee, who was formerly with CNBC TV 18 years ago and has worked with a bunch of different channels and different news outlets after that and is presently working with The Wire. She's also co founded platforms addressing core socio-economic issues like Money Mile and Samarthan. And apart from being a TEDx speaker, a Racina Young Fellow, she's a voracious reader who has some really interesting views on reading. So, without any further ado, let's just jump into this interview. Also, I apologize for the audio. There were some issues with the internet, so that's why the audio might sound a little bit off. I've done my best to kind of fix it, but please bear with us for this particular episode. Thank you. Hi, Mitali. Welcome to the Kitabi Karwan podcast. And I'm very excited because this is, in all probability, going to be the first episode of the third season of the podcast. And it's very rare for. So I inhabit like a few different worlds, and I think most of us do. And it's very rare that two of them collide. And this is one of those places where I work in the financial markets, and I've been a public policy enthusiast and a reader. And I think you perfectly fit into all those three things. Welcome to the podcast, Mitali.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be kicking off what looks like a slightly rocky year. I'm hoping after January we find our feet, but I'm happy to inhabit, not inhibit, both those worlds, which is finance and public policy.
Right. But yeah, we're not going to be talking about those two majorly here. Today we're going to be talking about books. Yes, which is what we should. But Mitali, the first question which I ask almost every guest who comes to my podcast, which are mostly authors, but this actually goes just as well for you because you're a journalist in the public sphere, right? So over the past 15, 20 years, due to social media or whatever reasons, journalists and authors have started inhabiting a much more public space than earlier, right? Earlier, there was a much more academic occupation of the public sphere, and now it's just, well, your personal lives are also entangled with it, or it requires something of this thing. So the question is most along the lines of this. Well, a lot of people know a lot about you. People who follow your work know a lot about you through the internet. But is there something about you that you'd like to share, which maybe perhaps the internet doesn't know? Probably on your reading side, or maybe something, I don't know, anything that you think you'd want to share with us.
So I think by definition, when you don't share something because you don't want to.
Exactly.
But I think maybe the one thing that perhaps a lot of people don't know, or maybe they don't associate with me, is that I'm actually an introvert. I'm very uncomfortable with very public displays. But that's the dichotomy, I think, of the profession that I love. I always wanted to be a journalist, that I was clear about. I don't think I signed up for the amount of public glare that it comes. Yeah, so it's almost like you have to put on a different personality when you are, on air, or when you are in front of a large gathering. But generally, I think, my real self is probably cocooned inside bed in pajamas with a book. So
exactly, like that's such a curious thing to know, because I follow your work, so I keep seeing you at like conferences and things here and there, and that's just the completely opposite. But I get it. I somewhat get it, I think. And perfectly, book reading kind of goes with an introverted personality, I guess, in that sense. Like, they're the best friends you can ever have in the most cliched ways possible. But so Mitali, where did your reading journey start? Were you always like or did you naturally your go towards books? Was it something like your parents got you into, or your school? What was it?
So, I think this is an inherited gift, and I, use that word consciously, that it's a gift, because I think it really is to pass that on to generation after generation, the love for reading. I come from a long line of teachers and academicians and professors, so I was very close to choosing teaching instead as a profession, but then the right turn I did journalism. My grandfather was a professor of English. My mother has taught all her life English as well. So I think, our houses were always sort of stuffed with books. Like every corner, there were books and there were magazines as well. And I think the best part about my growing years and how, the love for reading was inculcated was that nothing was ever taboo. There was nothing which was, you were not supposed to read or not supposed to look at. You were always free to explore and look at something and ask questions when you found something that you didn't understand, or where there was complexity to what you were reading or looking at. So I think that was the big force. My mom certainly is a huge force in the reading. I remember it was a tradition for us that every month, and she was a journalist as well at one point in time, very, very meager salary. But from that salary, every month she would take out a little bit and she would buy my sister and I a book every month. That was tradition. We lived in Pune, and we would drive down to the bookshop and we would pick a book out, budget of course. So I think all that really, layered into a very, very deep love for books, which I hope have passed on to my kids because they're voracious readers as well.
Oh wow, that's great to know, and I think that would be the most lovely feeling in the world. And while talking to you, I kind of get that, particularly that bit about there not being a taboo. So I mean, I come from a family where there's not a lot of reading, apart from the fact that my mother's a voracious reader and she writes a bit as well. And but the thing is, so I had a very weird story. My mother writes a lot in Hindi. She was a journalist for a Hindi newspaper back in the 90s. But she doesn't read a lot of English work. And I think when I was born, I was just naturally gravitated towards books, and she kind of encouraged me there. So I remember a book that I really hold close to my heart is The Kite Runner. And I read it on my 10th birthday, which my mother gifted me the book. I think she gifted me the book with that idea in mind. Oh, acha chotu bacha hai, it's the Kite Runner likha hua hai. It must be a nice, cute tale. Was quite an eye opener, but in the sense that they're not. I think, but that I remember was the first push I got towards exploring the real world. Like I think for me, I mean, obviously there's not trauma in that sense. It affected me a lot as a child, but it really pushed me to read more and explore more. And in that sense, I'm very grateful to my mother and that particular book to kind of explore the world. And I think that's, as you said, it's actually a gift that you pass on to generations. But it's interesting that you put it in that context, because a couple of days ago I was watching the Harry Potter 20-year reunion, and where I think it was one of the, I forgot which of the cast members, they pointed out that what the Harry Potter books did for reading was we were moving towards a generation where reading was dying. The idea of mass reading, this idea of people doing it as a hobby. And suddenly there were these 12, 13-year-olds, millions across the world, who wanted to read, who bought into this mania of reading, whatever reasons were it me. And I think that was somewhat to an extent true, that it is something that's happening now also. I mean, I'm 26 and I'm in no position to be commenting about how the younger generation is acting in that sense. But I do sense and see, maybe due to shorter attention spans, because of how I know how we're functioning over the years, YouTube videos, Facebook videos, and then reels. Maybe the next thing would be like 2-second videos. I don't know what it'll be. But what's your take on this? Have you noticed I know a way? Is this something that just in my head, or like a few of us heads, or do you think there's actually a fall in reading as an activity? And why do you think so? Is it just our shorter attention spans, or is there like a much deeper rooted problem?
No, I mean, unequivocally, I agree with you. It's like this, I think if you look at the generations gone by, and I'm many generations ahead of you, and you look at the big difference in, our childhood versus the childhood now, I think the one glaring difference that you would find was the absence of screens. We just didn't have them. And if we had them, it was one shared screen in the drawing room where you all sat down at 8:30 and watched Chitrahar, and on Sundays you watched, whatever, Mickey Mouse, He-Man, and that was it. But now there are screens that surround us everywhere, and it's a multi-headed monster. Siddharth. I mean, it's very unfair for us to sort of expect from kids, a high level of action against it, when as adults we are guilty of every 3 seconds picking up a phone. Let me check what's happening on Twitter. Let me check what's happening on Instagram. Who texted me on WhatsApp? So it's it definitely, I think, has played a big role in our lack of attention, in short attention span. And it really has to be, I feel now, a conscious effort to encourage reading. Just on, if when we talk about generations, I think the one thing that works, as it works in most things, is to lead by example. It's not possible for children to see you constantly scrolling your phone or watching
Right.
something on the internet and not reading, but then for you to turn around and say you should read more.
Right.
Yeah, that really has to be something that you nurture as an environment, and not just at home, as a community, in a school,
Right.
wherever possible. You have to open that window up for kids. You
Right.
have to gently nudge them towards it till it becomes an acquired habit.
Yeah, I mean, I get where you're coming from. I mean, uh, and this is something, in fact, even I can't say that I completely enjoyed this particular thing that I'm going to talk about, but the idea of libraries, right? I mean, the only kind of libraries I've been exposed to is my school library. And like maybe, I know the Asiatic, I'm from Bombay, so the Asiatic library in Bombay. But this culture of, by the time I was, a teenager and I could like actually go out and explore places on my own, like, with relative freedom, libraries had become a place to study, not to go and read and borrow books, right? I mean, that sort of culture has changed. I remember, and like, when I talk to like older people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, like as you described, they talked about how they would pick up books from like the Raddiwala, or like, they would go buy secondhand books, whether they're comics or like whatever, and they would read Reader's Digest and stuff. And that kind of culture, I know, and as you said, it's, I think, a more community thing rather than just like at an individual level. But so Mitali, one thing that I actually also wanted to ask you, and it's not exactly related to this but kind of close to it, and I mean, I personally have like conflicting views on it, which I don't really have a concrete view on, to the extent that, do you think there is a sort of classism when it comes to reading authors in India? Because I had this experience, right? I mean, there are a lot of authors who write what is broadly termed as mediocre work, right? Not in term, I mean, it's just like work. Yeah, like, I mean, that's the most polite way I can probably come up with it, right? I mean, they're massy works, they're very simply written languages, simple plots, but they are very popular with people. And then there were your let's say literary kind of work, well written works, or what we would term well written works, right? By famous authors, or authors who are acknowledged as good writers. Right, now there are two sides to it, right? There's this obvious side that, well, that is a fact, and this is how work is, and you should always try and read better. But the other fact is that it's a more I know, subaltern way of looking at things, that, well, English is a colonial language for a lot of people here, and any work that promotes reading, right? And like an author's defense would always be, well, my stories, however they're written, however poorly they're written, they appeal to people. My job is of a storyteller, and to reach out to them. So, I mean, what's your take on this? Like, do you think I mean, are we promoting mediocre writing at the cost of, well, democratizing the language, or the like let's say the hobby of reading, not the art? Or on the other hand, should we like kind of try and still push people to go beyond what their current reading capabilities is, and always try and read what is acknowledged in, like, as a much better written form? And is it one of those reasons why there is a decline in reading in the first place, to the extent that, like, I was just thinking about it, like, again, in that Harry Potter context. I mean, maybe I'm just unaware about things that I don't think there is. I mean, there was this phase when there was this bunch of Harry Potters and Twilight and Percy Jackson, and whatever my reservations about them might be, they were still of certain quality, and they had a certain massy appeal, which I think it's just now lacking, to the extent that you don't have teenager focused content anymore, or like younger children focused good content. Obviously, you have children's book. So, I mean, do you think this is a direct result of that people have just started moving towards more massy stories rather than just kind of involving people? What's Sorry for the long convoluted question, but you get what you get.
Context. I personally, for me, I have had a learning arc with this. So, to give you an example, when I was younger, in my probably in grade 11, 12, and college, I've always been a voracious reader, and I've always tried to read very wide. But I remember a phase where I would be quite snobbish about it, when my friends or classmates would read. The genre that was really popular with the young girls was the Mills and Boone romance novels.
Right.
Everybody was reading it. Everyone loved reading it. And for me, I was like, oh my God, how can you read that? It's trash. It's not a book, and etc. etc. I was wholly wrong. I would like to point that out, because I believe in terms of in terms of art, Siddharth, or performing art, or anything that you consume, you cannot be the deciding factor of what constitutes someone's interest or joy and what doesn't. So, whatever floats your boat, if you enjoy reading a particular genre or a particular author who may be disregarded or may not be regarded as right up there, I think that's a personal joy that I have to leave or we have to leave to that person.
Right.
It's a journey, maybe that's one book, maybe it ignites a particular flame where they want to explore more about what they read and they'd like to read something more and something more. In parallel to that, Siddharth, I think the one thing, and I think this is lacking for me, and I've come to it very late in life, is that I did not read enough Hindi literature to really appreciate the language and the beauty of it. I have not very, very sadly read enough of Bengali literature to really appreciate the beauty and nuances of it. I think I've been quite streamlined in terms of reading a lot of English literature and English novels and going down that road. So I think that knocking someone's taste for reading is just it's just not cool. You know what I mean? Like whatever floats your boat. If you like reading it, please read it. I'm only now beginning to read and appreciate the beauty of Hindi as a language, and I feel so sad that I have missed out on all these years of not having read it and absorbed it. So no, I don't subscribe to the view that there is a must read and a must not read. I think it's your journey. With books and many other things, what you choose to watch, what you find funny. This is part of the problem, right? I mean, they're so keen on telling other people what they ought or ought not to do that we forget about scaling up what's happening within us.
Right. No, and it's interesting that you brought up Hindi literature for that matter, because that is, I think that's something I'm struggling with now as well. Like, I mean, when I look, and I think it's a very vicious circle, because I mean, I'm pretty sure you and like I come from a similar education background to the extent that we went to English speaking schools where English was a language. In school you're asked to talk in English with everyone, read in English. That's everything that's around you, right? And same goes on for college, वगैरह. Now, so that's something I thought about last couple of years ago, and I started like, okay, let's try and change this. And I picked up a few books from my mother. And now it's the vicious circle being that it takes me probably like double the time to read, say, a page of Hindi literature as opposed to a book in English. And now the older you grow, like, I mean, you can acknowledge, like with your schedule and like everything, you have very limited time to do something. Now, obviously, you won't. It's a very odd circle where it takes you longer to do that activity, and that is why you can't really push and do a lot of it. And I think it just becomes very deep rooted, because it's a very interesting thing that when you read, I was so on my podcast, one of the former guests I had was Dr. Debali Mukherjee, who had translated Rokta. It's by Sunil Gangopadhyay, a Bengali piece into English, and she spoke a lot about how the politics of language are so evident when you read different literature in different languages. Something very simple being that how Indian society, or like most Indian languages, would have, say, words for, say, mama, nana, nani, right? Distinguishing each familial relationship, while the English language would have an uncle or an aunt instead of like your chacha and mama would both be an uncle, right?
Yeah.
Right, and you'll have like a maternal grandmother instead of nani, like it'll be a two-word. And so like those that's just like an academic way of looking at it, but totally, like, those languages have so much beauty in them which just kind of escapes readers. Like, that's something I try and do is over the past few years, is try and read more from different like continents or like areas or regions which are not generally read from, right? And yeah, so that actually brings me to another question that I
just wanted to add also, Siddharth, very quickly on that.
Yeah.
I think the more we read the language and the more we explore other languages, the more we understand how wide it can be. I mean, one person, and there are some really awesome folks out there on Twitter, along with all the other not so awesome folks. And one of them that I follow is Varun Grover, who he's a satirist, but he writes so beautifully. And a tweet that he wrote on Hindi Divas is just imprinted in my head. I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember all of it, but he talked about how he said, Hindi jaisi bhasha, it is sourced from फारसी, उर्दू, इसमें कई और भाषाएं भी
जी
हैं।
हाँ
हिंदी एक नदी है, चलायमान, उदार,
हाँ
इसे नदी रहने दीजिए, अपना निजी तालाब मत बनाइए। I think that
right
speaks, it speaks volumes about
exactly
how richly blessed we are in all these languages and
right
how many influences over thousands and thousands of years have gone into it. And the
right
more all of us read, everything that's around us,
right
the more I think we can appreciate it.
right and I think and that's a very interesting point that you made because I think language I remember we had this very brief conversation yesterday and while we were talking about what we can talk about and not and you mentioned something which is actually very true. Everything is political today, right? And when you look at it in that very specific lens here, that that is one of the problems that exists today, right? I think the fact that a lot of I hate using these terms, but say liberals are more English speaking, like the ability to express an academic opinion in Hindi is so desperately needed. Like for example, like there are barely any feminist papers, or maybe there aren't widely propagated in like my echo chamber, I guess. In say in Hindi, you won't find like a lot of feminist talk in Hindi, or maybe a lot of talk about how say communalism in Hindi, right? And I think that's where you lose half the battle in that sense, right? If you can't really talk to a person in a language they kind of deem native, you kind of lose half the battle there anyway. And so that actually is the next question that I had in mind was the so I get it how for fiction that is the snobbish culture that we've had to kind of move past. Even I had the same thing in college. I would kind of look down upon people reading certain kind of literature, but have grown past it. Like I've come to uh, terms with it in a very different way altogether. But I think that becomes a slightly different paradigm when it comes to non-fiction work, right? Because I mean, traditionally books have always been associated with knowledge, right? And simply because of the fact that it takes effort to kind of come up with a particular book, it's deemed or at least assumed by a reader to be researched, or to have to try and quote facts, or maybe quote facts and then present an interpretation of it. But what I've also noticed, and but again, it's subject to my biases and my uh, knowledge or lack of knowledge thereof, that there's this proliferation of books that talk about non-fiction books which talk about events from a very biased perspective and present them as fact, right? I think I forgot the name of the book about the Delhi riots, which was initially being published by Bloomsbury. So again, I'm very divided on this from the entire context of well whether it's free speech, whether these books should be published, whether should be encouraged, like what's our role as readers, or say you have a decent following on social media enough to influence people about what they should read or not. I'd have a reasonable influence in that sense. So do we have a responsibility in the sense of talking about non-fiction work that doesn't agree with our value system or our biases? Or where does this entire thing go? Like, should we even promote this in the first place? Should we have a standard for what non-fiction books should kind of stand by? What's your take on this?
My take on this is that non-fiction by definition is not fictitious. This is not about my value system or what I believe in or what my political leanings might be. It's not about any of that. It's about the fact that non-fiction equals facts. It's just as simple as that. So if there is a book that you are writing that is non-fiction, then please stick to the facts.
Right.
Don't manipulate them,
Right.
don't misinterpret them, don't
Right.
selectively report them.
Right.
Just stick to what the facts point to. Because I
Right.
think we are, we are in this really, and we're not alone in it. That's the problem. I think many parts of the world are in it with us. We are slowly sort of mixing up fact and fiction and belief and opinion, and all of it is just this really mixed up ball of vicious hatred right now. So for books like the one you're alluding to, they are simply not rooted in facts. If you want to present your point of view, you're very welcome to do that, but you cannot term it as an accurate, evidence-based
Right.
narrative of accounts as they occur, because they are not. You have to present what happened with the honesty of what the facts present for themselves. And I think
Right.
this is having more and more. It's happening for some, as you pointed to, in recent events, but it's happening more and more with history, and
Right.
that really disturbs me, because
Mm.
it disturbs me because of what our younger generations are absorbing. They're
Mhm.
not absorbing, a linear set of events as they occurred. They're absorbing events as how I may choose to see them.
Correct.
I may not like a particular ruler, so I'm going to decide that from
Right.
tomorrow, ruler XYZ was just a bunch of crap. He was a
Right.
jerk and he was good, and cancel. Done.
Right.
He's out. You know, this to me is really dangerous,
Mm.
and this to me, frankly, is not non-fiction.
Right.
It's the same malaise that a lot of journalism is struggling with. But
Right.
in answer to a specific question on books, I think you have to be clear about what you're writing.
Right. No, but so I completely agree with what you're saying. I mean, that's obvious. But then, what what responsibility lies on a reader in that sense, right? To kind of when he or she picks up a particular book, or for that matter, on a publisher for that, whether or not, say even when someone's trying to put forward a point of view, or they're misrepresenting something, whatever, does the onus lie on the publisher to kind of not publish this in the first place? Does it lie on the reader to not read it or does it lie on the reviewer to kind of make sure that the public knows that this is uh, kind of not an accurate representation of what has happened, just a point of view based on selective whatever, right? Where do we, I mean, where do we
Yeah.
go from here?
I think all three are in really different places. It would be very difficult to assume that the reader will practice the discretion of
Yeah.
fact checking a book that he or she is reading. I think
Yeah.
social media has indicated that much to us. I generally want to surround myself with people who think the same way as me. We talk about the same stuff. We have the same
Right.
opinion, and that is the biggest problem of social media, right?
Echo chambers.
Little echo chambers or wells where the same
Right.
frogs are talking to each other about the same thing, and we're all guilty of it.
Right.
I wouldn't want to hear a particular opinion that I don't agree with. So
Right.
after a point, what will I do? Maybe I'll block that person, or mute that person, or unfollow that person, and
Right.
my job is done. So I think it's difficult to place that much responsibility on the reader. I definitely think there is a great deal of responsibility on the shoulders of a publisher, just as there would be on the shoulders of a media organization or a news organization, to be responsible about reporting. For the reviewer, it's many times forward, Siddharth. Frankly, it's so
Hmm.
many times forward that I'm not sure it would create as much impact as it
Right.
as it should. How many people go out and actively seek or look for a review about a particular book?
Right.
It's really people like you and I who are such kidas about books that you want to read up a review,
And
and you want to read the latest Sally Rooney that's come, and you can't
Hmm.
wait to read the reviews about it. So I think the reviewer and the reader are a little bit distant. I certainly think the publisher is very, very responsible for the content that they put out, and of course, writer is the ultimate.
Okay, so this has turned into a lot more serious conversation than I intended. So I'll kind of take a step back and I'll kind of move towards a question which most bookworms kind of detest, but I'll still kind of go for it. I won't ask you to name your favorite book. Obviously, that cannot ever be this thing. But I would really want to know the kind of books that have impacted you a lot. Like maybe they might not be your favorite book as such, but it might have had a hard impact on you in terms of how you shaped up as a person or in your career or whatever. So were there, like, I'm sure there were books that, can you just like name a few of them or can tell us how they kind of
Yes,
impacted?
first, actually, I was amused when because it came to me later when we were talking about this whole book snobbery. One particular genre that I really dearly love is graphic novels.
Oh,
I love, and I remember, over the past few years when I've been picking up graphic novels, people who are with me would often tease me saying, "Oh, it's a comic book," and I said, "No, it's not a comic book; it's a graphic novel.
right.
They're two different things." So yeah, graphic novels I dearly love. I
Uh-huh.
think they're works of art, frankly, many of them. In my formative years, of course, I was a big Enid Blyton fan. So
Right.
all I wanted to do was go to a boarding school like Mallory Taz or Sinclair's and live the charmed life that they did. I love mystery as a genre,
Okay.
but I'm slowly moving away from that because I'm finding it a little too violent and dark. So I'm consciously stepping away. I'm a big fiction lover, frankly. That's really my big love. Unfortunately, last year especially, I hardly got to read any fiction because of the number of book interviews that I had to do. So there was a lot of non-fiction and a lot of politics and economics in it. I think when I think back, though, in terms of books that really stood out for me, Siddharth, it's strange, and I don't want to bracket them as such because that's the worst thing to do. But a lot of gay literature has really it's really left a mark on me. Like it's really left. When you read a book and then you just want to curl up for a minute and soak it in because of the sheer beauty and sadness of it. So some of those books have really stood out for me. A Little Life is one book that I read a couple of years back by Giri, I think if I'm pronouncing the name right, which was just stunning. Shaggy Bain was another beautiful book. Most recently, I read Earth Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. And all these books, I think I'm just stunned by the ability to write. I mean, there are only so many words in the English language, but to do what you do and to read this magic with what you write is
That's actually a very beautiful way of putting it, and I'm so glad you mentioned that you like fiction, and like, I mean, because so I mean, I've been following your, like, I follow you on social media, so I know that you, and when you mentioned Sally Rooney, I remember you read, I think a few months back you read her new book. I just finished it a few days back, and I was so pumped when I think you'd also interviewed Anuradha Roy for when her new book had come out. I had her on my podcast last season, and I'm a huge fan of her work. Like, I was just thrilled when I saw her interview with you as well. So, but like, the reason why I'm asking you this is, it's interesting you mentioned this because your work, your profession is something that deals with nonfiction, as you mentioned, right? You've been reading a lot of economics and finance. But has reading fiction kind of played a role in your career as such, like over the past, I don't know, 20-25 years? How has reading fiction impacted your career as a journalist?
It's an interesting question. I think language. The more you read, the more comfortable you are with the language, the more you learn to play with words, the more you learn to write in a particular way. So as a journalist, I can't think of a bigger skill to have acquired through reading than the gift of the language, the ability to play with words, the ability to find different ways of saying something, the ability also to learn. Really, I think so much of what you learn about other cultures and experiences is that you're just diving into a book. All these Scandinavian history novels, and which of us have been over there to those places? But now we know all these places, and we know what the weather pattern is, and what the forest is. I mean, I think fiction has so much to lend.
Yeah, that's quite true. And in fact, I had this conversation a few days back with someone about, and I keep having, like, it's one of those recurrent things, right? It's interesting you mentioned that context, like Scandinavian mystery novels, because I had this context in conversation in context of Murakami novels about how, and this also just translates into how you're reading translated work, because often our perception of, say, a culture or a country might be warped by what that author A represents in his or her work, and second, about how the translation comes through. And I mentioned Murakami because he's like very popular among people, to the extent that he writes in Japanese, his works translated into English. So when today Siddharth, or like when Mitali reads Murakami, they're reading a translator's version of Murakami's Japan, right? And I mean, it just might be the actual Japan, or it might be a version of it. So it's one of those thoughts you kind of keep having. But so you mentioned,
Murakami, you can also you can choose which part of Murakami you want to associate with. Like he writes as much fiction as he writes about running and
exactly.
Fighting. Yeah. And I have frankly not read anything of his, on his books on running and stuff, which I know for a lot of people is they really connect with that. I've read all his fiction. That's what I get. from
Yeah.
him. So yeah, what an amazing author to have that
Yeah.
kind of body of.
Yeah, no, I remember, I think it was the beginning of, it was somewhere during the pandemic that I read what I talk about when I talk about running. And it was it's a very interesting, because he writes a lot about how he's runs a lot, obviously, and how he associates it with his writing process. And it's just very, like, kind of appealed to me a lot. Like this, I was just very curious about the work. But it's great that you read Murakami as well, because this next question kind of, I know, again, one of those questions leaves all readers on the fence about. Like, I mean, I mentioned Harry Potter a lot. We spoke about Murakami. At the end of it, almost all literature in that sense nothing of it is perfect. If I know, if I hate to use the term, but from a woke culture perspective, right? Not every author would be perfect. They would have their own opinions, which might not, again, appeal to, say, our personal value system. Let's just leave the world out of it, or like a particular system out. That your this thing, but you may or may not enjoy the work that person presents. Like like say Murakami's depiction of women, or J.K. Rowling's comments on transgender people. So how do you deal with that dichotomy? Like, I mean, is it that, what is your stance hence, like, when this said occurrence up, when this occurs, right? When you find out, like, you do not kind of agree with the author, do you kind of separate the art from the artist, as they say, or is it like a deal breaker for you there? Because I'll just add another anecdote. So what happened is, last year I hosted a giveaway on my page, which was a Harry Potter themed giveaway, and it was something. So it was some anniversary, something we were celebrating. And one of my followers reached out to me and said that, by doing this, you shouldn't be doing this because whatever, J.K. Rowling. And I said, okay, even though I disagree, it's kind of about the nostalgia and, the emotions you hold for the book and the literature rather than. And her argument was that, well, by, kind of promoting it or still talking about it, you're adding to what that person is, accruing from it, the royalties and everything. So, like, even if you are adding one more Harry Potter reader to the world, you're supporting J.K. Rowling in that sense. So, I mean, I didn't really have a very good answer, and I've been kind of struggling with it. So I asked this question to everyone I can do to kind of get some more clarity in life, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? First of all, I'm very ashamed to admit I have not read a single Harry Potter, single one.
It's
It's a
perfectly fine.
genre where I don't get that genre. My kids are so small and I have nothing. So when they discuss it with me, I'm like, okay, yeah, of course, yes.
Yeah.
But I know nothing of it. But I hear you, yeah. I think there is a little bit heartbreak associated when anyone, not just an author, but a singer or an actor or a performer or a politician, falls in our eyes or does something which truly seems not the right thing to be doing.
Mhm.
And it's tricky. Would I stop reading? I'm not sure. I don't think I've sort of had to face that challenge yet. But I think it would certainly put a break between me and the individual. I
Right.
would think twice before reaching out to watch their content or to read their books. So I don't feel it so strongly, for example, with authors, but in the Me Too movement, there were so many performers and comedians who were really exposed for their actions. I cannot bring myself to watch anything by them,
Right. Right.
unfortunately. But this is just me. I mean, I don't want to say this is the way it should be, but I completely hear you, and I think this is a tricky one. Um, the only thing I would say is it's tough to fight the whole world's battles. So I think you have to decide. You have to decide what is a hard line for you, and what is something that you are willing to forgive, or you don't think it's something that you should build a barrier with your icon, your reading icon,
Right.
or your any other icon with. So if some things are a no go, then I respect that. You should dissociate. But if you feel that there's scope to explore and to forgive and forget and move on, that should be an individual choice. I think the other problem, like I was saying, Siddharth, is that there's so much pressure now, and I mean this in both directions. I don't mean this just for one school of thought. There is now so much pressure because of social media. You have to act and you have to speak, and why did you not tweet about it? and why did you
Right.
not speak about it? There is no time to think and absorb and make a rational choice based on what you see. You have to act now. Say
Right.
she's a crapper. Say this is
Right.
wrong. I think that's unfair.
Fair. That does make sense. And first of all, you don't need to apologize for not reading Harry Potter. I think that's just a stupid thing people do. Like it's the same snobbery we were talking about. That, oh, you haven't read Harry Potter. What are you doing in life? Pata nahi, I mean that too I never. I mean I'm guilty of it doing it earlier.
Yeah,
Yeah. I
Harry
mean.
Potter,
Yeah.
Heroes of Olympus, Percy Jackson. My God,
Yeah.
that
But
genre is like
but
exploding.
but I mean I don't know if it's about the genre, but I mean it might be for that for you as well. But I think I mean so for me, I think one of the reasons why Harry Potter was such a huge influence on me was because I was reading them at roughly the same age the characters were in, and that's the beauty of what I felt Harry Potter was with. That the characters were very well written to the extent that the kind of issues a 14-year-old would face, say, like were very similar. Obviously, you had a very different element to it, and I think that built up on it, which I think I mean, I wouldn't recommend it to like someone who's starting out reading at 25, for example. I wouldn't recommend Harry Potter to that person ever in their life, right? I mean, it won't really appeal to them. But okay, so we are heading towards the end of the interview. So I just have like two quick questions for you. One, if you could just tell us a few authors that you've liked over the years, or maybe you definitely would like, voraciously recommend to people I know to all the listeners of the podcast, which you really, really would want to. And the other questions is slightly different. So one of your colleagues back from CNBC, Udayan, had started writing a lot of fiction and good fiction for that matter. I really liked a couple of his books that I read. Is that something on your horizon? Do you think you'll end up writing fiction in the future? You write a lot of non-fiction like articles and books. That too happens. I'm pretty sure it might even end up being a book someday. I don't know. I mean, I hope it does come out. I really enjoy your work. But is there something like being a fiction reader? Is that something a fiction piece of work is going to come from you? Is that something we can expect?
So let me answer, both your questions. First, in terms of authors that I recommend, I think Sally Rooney will certainly go down as one of the great chroniclers of our times and
Mm-hmm.
this generation and how they think and how they move and how they love and how they live. Julian Barnes is, another fantastic author. God, there's so many from the late greats, Graham Greene. From India, I think from the graphic novel genre, there is an artist and a writer, and I call her an artist because she's that Amrita Patil. I don't know if you read her work, but one of the standout pieces is a book called Adi Parva. It's just you literally want to frame every page up on the walls of your home. It is that
Oh,
beautiful. When people ask you, you blank out.
of
So
course.
there's
I know. I can completely
there's
understand.
Farhan Pamuk who writes so beautifully. In autobiographies, which I'm not a big fan of, the one that I really enjoyed was Open by Andre Agassi.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was a really good read. Joe Nesbo for a while I liked reading from the murder mystery genre, but now I just find
Right.
it too much. There's so many people being cut up and hung up. But if you like murder mystery, I think that's great. And to answer the second part of your question, um, I think the one thing that the last 2 years have taught me is that you really don't know what will happen. Yeah, you just do not know. You can plot it and say, okay, in January I'll be here, in February I
Hmm.
have to do that course, and then in March I'll be doing this interview, and then you can just see it all go up in smoke.
Right.
So yeah, I haven't thought about it frankly.
अच्छा सोचा ही नहीं है.
सोचा है पर अभी
हाँ.
तक तो कुछ किया नहीं उसके लिए not about fiction at any rate
Yeah.
non-fiction of course like you said you keep writing so your mind keeps working in that cycle um, so never say never. I think that's
That's
one way to get it.
man, that's interesting. You put it in the context of COVID, huh? You never know. But I just asked because, like, I mean, I think almost 90% of everyone who reads always like have I know just a tiny aspiration to be an author someday. Ki, oh, I'll write something. But yeah, and as for the blanking bit, I think now you know what your interviewees feel like. I mean, now that when you interview people, you you like आके बुला के सवाल पूछते हो, अब आपके साथ भी हो रहा है.
So one of the best articles I read last year was, I think it was in the New York Post, by this
Mhm.
journalist, about how her kids basically confiscated her phone for a month because she was so hooked on to Twitter.
Mhm.
Her mind was wired only with what to tweet. Like, everything she looked around her, she was always
Mm.
trying to form a smart tweet about it. So I think it's another problem for
Yeah.
people in the public domain. You're always thinking of how to portray something
Mhm.
uh, in those many characters. So
Mm.
I think, yeah, it's a good idea to sort of detox from social media. Think of writing longer form,
Yeah.
with more ambitious pieces.
Yeah, I think
That's what I
so. Like social media, like I mean, they can rant on and on about weird kind of issues it throws up. But that was one of the reasons why I started Kitabi Karwan in the first place. I mean, social media had kind of reduced. I mean, earlier, at least when you read, like, say, in an article on, say, an online publication or a newspaper or a magazine, say it's an interview or like a review of a book, right? It's far more expressive than like that short post on Instagram, right? But because of how social media is designed, A, it's designed for shorter attention spans, and B, it's designed for aesthetic beauty. So, I mean, people like, I mean, you put a really good picture of a book, well clicked picture, great, you're a nice photographer, but like the content in it, that paragraph, I was like, at least acha paragraph to likho. That is some, or it give me some insight into the book. As a reader, I would want to see more of it, right? So yeah, like I think that is a very weird pressure, and that's something I don't do at Kitabi. Like I get told about this so many times, try those SEO kind of things, what words would do better on Instagram or reach out to more people kind of thing. Like that isn't really the point of why you're doing this activity in the first place. So yeah, I mean,
What did Vikram say? Another
yes.
great
Oh
point
wait,
that said,
yes. That I wanted to ask you about. Okay. So the thing is, I've read A Suitable Boy. I loved the book. I in fact,
oh,
yeah. No. So I didn't. So that's, yeah. You can sense where the question is going. But so I did like an Instagram live with my best friend. Like we did like a 16-part series of an hour-long conversations on the book. Like we did each part. There were 19, but we mixed a couple of the shorter parts. But I didn't watch the series. So when the series came out, I got really mixed reviews. So I was told, if you really like it, don't. I mean, you may like it, you might not like it. So it's better you stay away. So it's like, okay. And that I got from a few trusted sources. So I was like, okay, let's not risk it. But while I was just googling you, I found out that you had a cameo on the series. What is it on this thing? I'm very curious. I mean, I haven't seen it, so I just wanted to know. But what role? What was this about? And how did it come about? I mean, I think that's every reader's fantasy. Like, if you're one of the books that you like Vikram Seth, and if you get to be like a part of it, that's just excellent.
So, my husband is, a very active member of the performing arts community. He's a
Okay.
singer, he's an actor, he's a musician.
Right.
Meera is a friend of his, and for A Suitable Boy, Monsoon Wedding, the film, was adapted into a musical in India, and he was
Oh.
part of that. That's where Meera and he collaborated. After which she was working on this project, so she actually reached out to him, asking him to do a cameo in the series, and we happened to have met at social gatherings, and that sort of offer came to me as well. I think through it all, Siddharth, my one thing was, what if in Lucknow Vikram Seth happens to visit the set? Like
Mhm.
what if he
Or what if?
walks in? Yeah,
है ना?
that was my big what if question. Obviously, what are the chances that he can
यार,
come down to Lucknow to watch a shoot? But that's what
maybe
it was, and yeah, a
you can
really
wish for it.
small scene with with Lata's elder brother and wife, and it was a setting where they're meeting two prospective boys and just the interplay between that.
No.
So it was a great experience, yeah,
Yeah.
of course. But I think the big thing for me was, oh my God,
Yeah, that's half the reason I started the podcast in the first place. Like, okay, I get to talk to authors I like. That's what what more could you want? Like, you can directly ask them like questions that are in your head. Like, I mean, I've like this conversation for that matter, right? I mean, I've been following your work.
I have such a vivid memory of weekends where we would be curled up with my mom, and we would be reading beastly tales from here and there,
Yeah.
which was again by Vikram Seth, and it was just hilarious. So I think these are gifts that you are born with. I don't
Right.
think I can keep typing away till I'm 80. I think I'll never write with the grace that he.
Yeah, I mean, Vikram Seth is a tall standard to beat. I mean, if that's the standard you're looking for, I mean, I wish you do attain it. If you do, I'll be the happiest person in the world. But
लंबा रास्ता है.
what, पहुंच सकते हो यार आप you've seen I've seen your writing, so it's great. I mean, who knows? Fingers crossed. And that's all I'm saying. I think you have a lot of people who follow your work who would want to see you write. Maybe non-fiction, fiction, but something more. But on that note, I'll close the end of this podcast. Thank you so much for doing this. This was absolutely lovely. And yeah, I really hope to see maybe someday your book out there, and then maybe we'll have you back on the podcast to talk about that book.
Absolutely. Here's hoping, fingers and toes crossed. And
Yeah.
thank you so much. It was such a fun chat. And
Mm.
I just want to say it's very easy for all of us to kind of just carry on with the cycle of life. There is so much. There is so much in our days, and it's so full. So I think it is really commendable that you take the time out for this labor of love, that you make the effort to find people, and you make the effort to have conversations about books. You don't need to do it, but you do it. And I think that's really great. And I think this in itself is also something that we're gifting to generations forward, because they may not want to listen to me, but they may want to listen to someone like you and what you have to say about reading. So all the very best.
Thank you so much for saying that there'll be someone who doesn't want to listen to you but me. I find that very difficult to fathom. But thank you for your kind words. Thank you so much. If you enjoyed this podcast, please check us out on all our social media platforms. We are available across all podcasting platforms on YouTube, on Instagram. You can find us at the rate Kitabi Karwan on Instagram, or just search Kitabi Karwan on Google or a platform of your choice and you'll find us. We carry out Instagram lives, giveaways, we talk about books, we talk to bibliophiles, talk to authors, and basically try and create a reader's world through all of our platforms. Do check us out and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.